Also, there are some study show the case, the so-called the case of productivity paradox, meaning that technology advancement may not lead to the higher productivity. Over the last 15 years, when we use more substantially IT technology, but at the same time, productivity in the region, Asia Pacific one, continue to be diminishing, continue to be decreasing. Many people believe that technology, the new one, can create a lot of jobs. One example is Gojek, Indonesia company, right? And many kind of platform business, e-commerce, they create a lot of jobs. But at the same time, also many people believe that we can lose a lot of jobs. Projection that maybe 70%, 80% of the traditional job in the industry like textile garment, footwear, furniture, labor-intensive industry can be under threat of the job loss, right? And another example, people say now we shift from the firm-center economy to the crowd-center economy. And people easier access to information opportunity, business opportunity. So we can have higher economic growth, not just higher economic growth, but also inclusive growth, right? But others say, we have more problem with that because of digital and skin divide, right? And many people still left behind. And last but not least, technology, automation, AI, and many other kind of technology can change a lot of global supply chain, production network. And our region has the most dynamic production network and the value chain in the world. And that can have a very significant implication for ASEAN, for East Asia, for Asia Pacific economy. So the key question is how our economy can strive and can stay agile to survive, and how we can minimize the cost in transition, right? We would like to leave the past, and how we can get the benefit when moving ahead, when we don't understand many things, right? So the cost, if you would like to change the past, but how to move forward, many things we don't know yet, right? So that's the key question, and I hope that session can address on these issues. And we have four key speakers, right? First, Professor Richard Van Wyn. I hope everyone know him, right? I read a lot of his article and book, even I don't understand much, right? He's a professor of international economics at the Graduate Institute, Geneva. He is also ex-president of the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. The latest book, New Globalization, Information Technology, and the New Grid Conversion. And that book see as one of the 5 most important books of globalization, right? Please come to the stage, please. Professor Van Wyn. The second speaker, Mr. Michael Fang. He's a Deputy Chief Executive Industry, Chief Human Resource Officer, and Chief Data Officer as a Skin Future Singapore. Please come to the stage. The third one, Mr. Peter Lovelock. He's a director and co-founder of the Technology Research Project Corporate. And I IT telecommunication-based think tank with office in Singapore, China, and Australia, right? He is also advisor to PCC APEC on the Internet and Digital Economy Roadmap. And last but not least, Mr. On Lee. He's a CEO and CTO of the GDP Labs and CTO of the GDP Venture, venture capital, right? That kind of company. He has over 30 years of experience in internet, mobile, AI, blockchains, semantic web, knowledge graph, consumer enterprise software development. He has been a team to startups, strategic, new product, and last company in the US, Indonesia, China, and India. Thank you very much. And to give Taiwan, please, can I invite Professor Van Lee to give the keynote speech, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for those kind remarks of introduction. And I want to thank CSIS for inviting me, allowing me to share my ideas with this very impressive group of participants, in particular Marie Pangosu and Jose Damora for making it possible. And my apologies for not knowing more about Indonesia. I'm a long way from an Indonesian expert, so my comments are going to have to be rather general. But I hope that you take the ideas, the thought frameworks, and they allow you to think harder and deeper about what it means for Indonesia. Because in my view, more thinking, harder thinking, and deeper thinking about the future is absolutely necessary. You see, in my view, I think the future of globalization will be very different than the globalization we know today and the globalization we've known in the past. And I think it's changing faster than most people believe and in ways few expect. So harder, deeper, and more thinking really is necessary. I'm going to start with a small piece of intellectual infrastructure, maybe a scaffolding to think about globalization, a framework to think about globalization. And I want to use it to argue that globalization in the past has changed and is likely to change in the future, both how and why. Now, to do that, I'm going to have to simplify, clarify. I'm going to think about globalization, invite you to think about globalization this way. Arbitrage drives globalization. Whenever anything is more expensive in one part of the world than another, companies will exploit those differences by buying or making it where it's cheap and selling it elsewhere. Now, up till now, most thinking about globalization has focused only on goods, arbitrage in goods. But I'd like you to expand that tonight and think about goods, know-how, and labor services. And I'd like to assert that this arbitrage, this globalization, is constrained by three costs, not just trade costs and tariffs. Trade costs for goods, communication costs for arbitrage and ideas, and face-to-face costs for arbitrage and labor services. And I'd like you to associate this with past, present, and future globalization. I think past globalization was all about lowering trade costs and increasing arbitrage in goods. And then from about 1990, when information and communication technology got really good and allowed global value chains to happen, it was also about knowledge. That's the global value chain revolution. It was really about companies being able to take their know-how and combining it with labor abroad. Going forward, I think it will be very different again. I think it will be about lower face-to-face costs which will allow arbitrage in labor services, not just goods and know-how. So I'm going to try this infographic. Let me just try and explain what I mean here. So the past globalization, which was all about arbitrage in goods, in my view, goods move, technology and labor services don't. So here, let's just stylize the world into two groups: headquarter economies, say the G7 countries, and the factory economies. And the headquarter economies had high know-how to labor ratios, which supported high wages. And the factory economies had low know-how to labor ratios, which meant they had low wages. Now, when it came to manufacturing, high-tech, high wages won, and the G7 dominated manufacturing worldwide. So they took the know-how, German know-how, plus German labor, made German goods, and those sold well around the world. Today's globalization, which is arbitrage in tech, goods and tech move, labor services don't. So one way to think about that is ICT opened up a pipeline that allowed G7 firms to take their firm-specific know-how in manufacturing and move it to nearby developing countries and combine it with low-cost labor. That's a very different type of competition, and it created high-tech, low wages. It revolutionized manufacturing. And countries like China or Thailand, who are using high-tech and low wages, make it very hard for countries who are trying to use high-tech, high wages, like the United States, or low-tech, low wages, like Brazil. Now, I would argue that digital technology is opening up a new pipeline that allows labor sitting in factory economies to provide services in offices in high-wage countries without moving. Now, when you think about that arbitrage, it's a big deal, because the prices in this world that are the largest are those for service sector workers. If you take, for example, my salary or the salary of a professor here in Indonesia, I'm looking at Marie, it's about 20 to 1. So if my university could somehow arbitrage that difference, there would be great benefits to Marie and my university for doing that. And the reason it wasn't done is not tariffs or the cost of moving goods. It's technological barriers based on face-to-face. But here's the thing. Digital technology is changing that reality. Digital technology is making remote workers less remote in many ways that I'll be talking about for the next, I have an hour and a half, don't I? Yep. So, that's right. Thanks. The chairman didn't think it was so funny. So, I'm going to explain why and how being less remote will change future globalization and open opportunities. So let me just get started with that, will I? Future globalization, labor service arbitrage. Now, before I explain how it's going to happen, let's look at this picture. How many of you have been in a room like that? Raise your hand, please. Oh, come on. Everybody else raise their hands. Just get on the bandwagon, okay. Now, ask yourself, why are they in the same room, in the same building, in the same city? Is it to save on trade costs? Or is it to save on telecommunication costs because email is so expensive? No, it's to save on face-to-face costs. And it's because they're producing a service, not a good. And when you produce a service, being face-to-face actually makes things easier. It's cheaper to get them all in the same room than try and do it another way because of technology. Now, digital technology is making remote workers less remote. So now we have low cost of moving goods, low cost of moving ideas, and lower cost of face-to-face. And that's going to open up a new type of globalization. I'd like to call it telemigration, or in my new book, did I mention my new book, The Globotics Upheaval? Can we get a tight bit of that? That's a joke, just teasing. The Globotics Upheaval is introduces telemigration, people in one nation working in offices in another. And if I wasn't trying to sell books, I'd just call it international freelancing or international telecommuting, but that's just not, it's not there. So, international wage difference makes telemigration profitable. Digitech makes it possible. And I want to talk about 4 ways in which Digitech is making this possible. The first one is domestic telecommuting is preparing the way. In rich countries like the United States, something like 40% of people work sometime remotely from the office, and many young people never go into the office. Now, what that means is our companies, the rich country companies, are rearranging workflows, going to matrix structures, going to project-based work. They're adopting collaborative software, cloud-based files. All this is to make it easier to slot in domestic telecommuters into the workflow. Now, once they figure out that they can use remote workers and foreign remote workers cost 1/10 or 1/20th, they will start to use more and more foreign service providers. This is, by the way, absolutely common in web development and a number of industries, very common already. The second is...
I'm Adrian McDermott, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Product Development for Zendesk. Zendesk is a cloud-based customer service platform. Currently, we have engineering teams in Copenhagen, Dublin, Melbourne, and Singapore. We have a large support presence in Manila. We had a need to build a team that focused on integrations and finding people with very diverse skills and knowledge of other people's software. The market in the Philippines in terms of developers is basically owned by Upwork. Everyone is either on Upwork or Upwork curious.
So think of these platforms. How many of you have heard of Upwork or Freelancer, Fiverr, Mechanical Turk? Okay, it's more common here. If I asked that in Europe, most people wouldn't have heard of it. But the point is, these are the container ships of the new globalization. It's how service providers from poor countries are getting into the offices in rich countries. It's like eBay or Alibaba, but for services. It's how the buyer and the seller find each other. It's how the financial transaction is underpinned. It's how the quality assurance happens. All these platforms are, in essence, connecting service workers around the world in a way they never were. Third, excellent telecommunication. And I won't spend much time on this because I'm running out of time, and you have all experienced how much better telecommunication is now than it was before. But we're about, together with 5G, we're about to get some radical increases in like telepresence, augmented reality meetings, virtual reality meetings, et cetera, et cetera. But it's essentially making people seem face-to-face when they're not. And lastly, and I think this is really understated, is machine translation. Now, it's not that good, as I understand, in Indonesian, because there's not yet a big enough data set. But for English and the UN languages, there was a revolution when the UN put online millions of hand-translated sentences in the 6 UN languages. And the geniuses at Google, I think our genius Google left, and the other AI geniuses, they trained models to translate sentence by sentence, not word by word. And that completely changed how good it is. Now, when you think about that, that's going to make a talent tsunami. In some sense, what happened in the 90s was hundreds of millions of low-cost workers joined the manufacturing workforce and transformed realities in G7 manufacturing. The 2020s is about hundreds of millions talented, low-cost foreigners joining the service sector. And they will change realities in the offices and workspaces in developing countries relatively fast. Okay, so what? Telemigration is unleashing the global talent tsunami. I said that one. First, it's affecting rich nations' service and professional jobs not just factory jobs. And one of the things I stress in the book is there's a very systematic thinking about the future of globalization by drawing analogies from past globalization. And that's a big mistake, because past globalization was about goods, manufacturing, mining, and agriculture. And things that take a long time in manufacturing and mining can go very fast in services. It's also, these people aren't ready for it. People in the top photo, they feel sorry for the people in the bottom photo when their factory closes. Pretty soon, they're going to start to see direct international wage competition up close and personal at the same time as robotic process automation, virtual assistants, and chatbots start to automate part of their job. So I think there's a serious chance that that would lead to an upheaval, which is the second word in the title of my book. Simon, did I mention my book already? Not yet. Okay, thank you. Conjecture. Telemigration will foster upheaval backlash against digital tech and globalization in advanced economies. If nothing else, it will give left-leaning Democratic candidates in the United States something to blame other than China and immigrants. Blame the tech. It will be irresistible. Look up Andrew Yang and the Yang Gang. There's a political campaign based on this already. Conjecture. The emerging market miracle will continue and spread. Emerging markets' true competitive advantage is quality-adjusted, low-cost labor. But their advantage was filtered through goods, and this made development difficult. So you took emerging markets' competitive advantage, which is low labor. It had to go into a factory or a farm. It produced goods, and then the goods were exported. But that factory bit is very difficult. It's complex, and most developing countries couldn't do it. Telemigration will allow emerging markets to export their advantage directly. Here's a conjecture. Time zones will matter more. I think South America will become emerging market exporters of services to North America, Africa to Europe, and Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia. Services are easier, lower scale economies, less complex supply chains and logistics, and geographic distance matters much less for services than for goods. So here's a little chart that's depressing in most parts of the world outside of here. If you take a triangle between Beijing, Hong Kong, and Tokyo and lay a circle on it, 40% of all world manufacturing is in that circle. If you're in that circle, it's relatively easy to join a value chain. If you're not, very difficult. And the circle on Europe, that's another 20%. Circle on factory North America, another 20%, which means the entire rest of the world shares the remaining 20%. If you're not in one of those circles, development has been very difficult for you unless you're exporting commodities. Now you're exporting services, it'll be much easier. Conjecture, service-led development will replace manufacturing-led development. For almost 200 years, the idea that you had to industrialize to get rich has been firmly stuck in our mindset, in our policies, in our institutions, in the international governance we have. It's all about industrialization. But I would submit to you that that time has come to a close, or will. Digital technology is automating manufacturing. So manufacturing is becoming jobless and all locally produced. There won't be any more Chinas. At the same time, digital technology is making trade in services more open. So there will be more Indias. Think India, not China. Think service value chain, not global value chain. Digital technology has disintegrated the value chain in many services and are allowing tasks that used to have to be done in the same building to be done far away. Legal services, journalism, financial services, medicine, all sorts of things can be done remotely. New development strategies. Think cities, services, and training, not factories, industrial equipment, and technology. If you want to join this new export boom, you have to focus on the people. And those people are mostly in cities. And what they need is training. And of course, this isn't going to happen tomorrow, but it's happening quickly. But when you do your development strategy and you think, should we spend billions and billions to build new ports and roads which will take 10 to 20 years to come online, to join a global value chain which won't exist in 20 years, maybe we should rethink or at least rebalance part of that. Now there's two developing countries who are in front of this. Kenya and the Philippines are explicitly trying to get their young people into this export industry, partly to absorb workers. Okay. I hope you like this one. See, future, big wave, very threatening, slowly moving. You guys don't like that one? No? The future of globalization, in my view, is coming faster than most people think and in ways few expect. I think the future of globalization will be based on the export of goods, and I think development strategies have to pivot from manufacturing export-led development to service export-led development. I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very, very exciting presentation. What I learned about the future of globalization, there's three words, right? First, super cost, tele-migration, and services-led development, right? The next one, please, can I invite Mr. Mike and Fang?
Thank you, Chairman. First off, I want to thank CSIS and PEC for the invitation to be here to speak with you. It's hard to follow Richard's act as well, because he's trying to tell us what the future looks like. I picked up a few pointers there. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We heard a lot about AI. We heard a lot about technology disruptions. And now we have, through Richard's presentation, a peek into what the future economy might look like. I want to share some of our thoughts from the Singapore context on how we are viewing disruptions and some of the things that we're doing to try to prepare the workforce and the economy for these disruptions. First off, let me just do a very quick introduction to the organization I'm with. It's Skills Future Singapore. It's a government agency that reports to the Ministry of Education. It was formed in 2016 by restructuring an existing statutory agency that was called the Workforce Development Agency. And it is pretty significant because the Workforce Development Agency, WDA, used to be part of the Ministry of Manpower, or Ministry of Labor, as you might call it here. So why did we take an agency, split into two, and move one part of it to the Ministry of Education? The secret will be revealed in my presentation. But let me just hold that thought for a while. Why did we make such a change? And I will touch on this as I go along. We've heard about the fourth industrial revolution. McKinsey, the McKinsey speaker this morning talked about various findings they have uncovered in their studies. I won't go into the details there, but I would just emphasize that the scope of the industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, the impact and the velocity is unlike previous industrial revolutions. As we think about the disruptions that are facing our economy, almost every single industry sector will be affected. Again, citing from Richard's earlier presentation, not just low-skilled manufacturing, goods-producing sectors, but professional services, the services industry, retail, legal profession, accounting, almost every single sector would be disrupted by technology. And so if we're not able to navigate these disruptions, our sectors will become less competitive. Businesses would start losing competitiveness, and that will affect the economy and eventually affect the jobs. So here are some statistics from various think tanks, McKinsey, OECD, World Economic Forum. You take your pick. Some of them are more pessimistic, than others about job losses. But I think what's clear is that as we think about young people that are entering the workforce today, they need to be prepared in their minds and in the skills that they have to be able to navigate multiple careers during their lifetimes, as many as maybe 6 or more careers. And so that begs the question, how are we structuring education and training to prepare the young people, to prepare our workforce for the future of technology, future of work? Education systems are very, very traditional, and that includes the system in Singapore. It's very structured, it's worked well for us for many years, and it's very much front-loaded. So for 12 to 16 years of formal education, then we send our graduates out and say, good luck for the rest of your life, have a productive life, and hope to see you on the other end. Well, if you think about the kinds of disruptions that's happening, the model of delivery of education clearly is not adapted for a fast-changing, disruptive economy. So I think there's a real need to rethink the approach towards learning and jobs. We launched a movement, a national movement in 2015. We call it Skills Future, and that's the same name of my the agency that I'm from bears the same name. And the Skills Future movement was called a movement. It wasn't called a program, initiative, a project, because it connotes a long-range, sustained focus on upscaling and reskilling the workforce, on developing a lifelong learning culture, because we believe that truly is what's needed if we want to navigate the disruptions of the future. I'll talk about various features that we focus on in terms of the new paradigm of education and training that we foresee. First off, we believe that education needs to be much more lifelong in nature. The front-loaded version of education that we are familiar with today is not going to be adaptive. Think about the rate of innovation in areas like AI. By the time we put that through a curriculum committee, design it, launch the courses, educate our kids, and they graduate, the skills are obsolete. Those skills, the competencies that's needed in the area of AI is being innovated daily in the industry. Right? How do we have a system that is more agile, more accessible throughout life? So moving from a front-loaded model to one that's much more lifelong learning. I talked about creating multiple pathways. So as people come through the system, your education and training system, they come through different pathways. But as they progress in the careers, they would be at different points as well. And we need to create those channels for them to come back into a more integrated education and training system. So our systems are quite disjointed today, right? College systems, after they graduate, thank you, bye. And then you have to find other ways of upskilling yourselves. So we're also looking at morphing our institutes of higher learning to embrace a much more lifelong model in their delivery. Integrating work and study elements, and this is to ensure that graduates coming out to a workforce have work-relevant skills. In fast-changing areas like ICT and AI, that becomes even more important, because what employers are looking for today is graduates that have the skills to be work-ready on day one, not in 6 months or 18 months' time after going through a long management training program. We also look at a set of priority and emerging skills where we think that's of importance to various sectors of economy. So this includes AI, data analytics, industrial, Internet of Things, applying smart solutions to urban problems, and so on. So we provide a range of training options there. But most of all, quite critically, is to make sure that we empower individuals. Because lifelong learning cannot just be supply-driven. Everything that I talked about earlier was supply-driven. What we really need is for every single worker in the workforce to be actively thinking about, what do I need to learn to stay relevant? my job requires me to go for additional upskilling, or I'm aspiring for the next job and it requires me to pick up these sets of skills. Until we can nurture a nation of lifelong learners, individuals that see themselves as learners for life, until we get to that point, I don't think we'll ever fully be ready for disruptions. But if we can get that amongst the nation as a whole, I think we'll be much more prepared for disruptions to come. In the interest of time, I won't go into all the details, but if you're interested in the various initiatives that we have under the SkillsFuture movement, you can come speak with me. I'll be happy to share with you. But I would just mention that there are a range of specific initiatives that are targeted at empowering individuals to develop the skills and to embark on lifelong learning, including providing SkillsFuture credit, an individual training account that individuals are free to use it for any kinds of learning that they want. There's also broad-based course fee funding for a range of upskilling and reskilling courses, and that's something that we've been doing for quite a number of years. There's a national portal, My SkillsFuture portal, that offers guidance for individuals that are looking for labor market information, for training options, for jobs that are linked to the training, and that's on the My SkillsFuture portal that's open to all our citizens. Specifically in the technology and emerging skills areas, we work with the industry to map out skills frameworks across 34 industry sectors. And here we define the job families in each of those sectors. We look at 6 levels of jobs, and for each job, we define the technical skills, the soft skills, as well as the emerging skills that's needed for each of those jobs. It's a very time-consuming exercise, but it helps us to get a sense of what are the skills that's needed as the economy shifts towards the future. And we refresh those skills frameworks on a regular basis. It's a broad-based program called SkillsFuture for Digital Workplace that's targeted at infusing a mindset of readiness to embrace digital technologies, to embrace the fact that workplaces are changing, jobs are changing, and the specific training in areas of emerging skills that I mentioned earlier through the SkillsFuture series. And these training programs are delivered through a range of private training organizations, the institutes of higher learning, so that's the polytechnics, our TVET technical education school, our universities, as well as a range of companies as well that support these training. I mentioned a little bit about skills framework earlier. Here's a pictorial representation of one of the skills frameworks. It's a very thick document, it's maybe about 400 pages for every framework. And under each area, as I mentioned, the technical skills, the generic soft skills, as well as the emerging skills are mapped out. If you're interested, again, look at our website. It's available for public reference. One of the key areas that I think is quite important for us to be able to embark on a national movement like SkillsFuture is to be able to coordinate across multiple agencies. And in our areas of work, we coordinate with other government ministries, in specifically the Ministry of Trade and Industry, the Ministry of Manpower, of course our Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Education. Those are our key stakeholders in moving in the SkillsFuture movement to upskill and reskill our workforce. We also work with our unions, our trade associations, training providers, as I mentioned, institutes of higher learning, and our industry partners. I mentioned earlier that we had restructured to be part of the Ministry of Education, and I think that's significant because we see the future of education and training as being tightly integrated. It's no longer about formal education, and then non-formal education used to be out of the system. We see that we need a much more integrated pre-employment training, which typically is delivered through formal education, and continuing education and training, which typically happens after individual graduates from the formal education institutions. We need a much more integrated system where individuals can come back in the system when they need, be able to take modular bite-sized training that's relevant to the jobs, and be able to then go back to the job and come back to the system as and when they need. And that's something that two of our universities have started offering what they call a 4+20 program. 4 years for your undergraduate degree, and for the next 20 years you can keep coming back and sit in different classes. We're still quite a way to go, but I think we have some of the initial steps in place that is helping us to navigate this uncertain future. I'll stop right there, but I'll just sum up by saying that traditionally governments are fond of long-range planning, forecasting, and then making sure the elements are right to deliver a longer-term plan. As we move towards an economy that's much more uncertain, much more dynamic in terms of disruptions, I believe that the emphasis needs to be shifted away from this long-range forecasting and planning mode into one which is trying to nurture the economy and the nation to be a lot more flexible, adaptable, and agile to face these changes. I'd be happy to have a further discussion during the Q&A or panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope that Skin Future Singapore can be a good example for us to follow, right? May I invite Mr. Leon? Only? Yeah, you first.
I think I've got yours up next.
To have presentation, right?
Yeah, okay.
Oh, which one? Okay. I follow mine.
Oh yeah, thanks, please. There we go. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Good afternoon. Thank you to CSIS, thank you to PECC for the invitation. I just want to focus on this idea of the deep economic impact that's been flagged. I think I just want to make 3 propositions. How many of you listen to podcasts? Why? I'm still trying to get my head around the economics of these things. And I apologise. I know it's awfully banal tech after all the whiz-bangery of the last few sessions. And to be honest, I'm listening to podcasts now myself. And for me, it's a mental health issue. I have to run long distances. I've got a short concentration span, allows me to focus on these issues. But I'm listening to one at the moment. VCs and the economic impacts of technology. And they raised some points last week. They had this guy on, the guy who runs the browser, Robert Cottrell, and the points that he raised I actually thought had some relevance and resonance for the issues today. For those of you who don't know the browser's a site. Robert goes out there, surveys some 1,000 art pieces every day, summarises them, curates them, sticks up the best 6 or 12 or whatever it is. Great site. Take a look at some point in time. Thebrowser.com. But they were discussing the complete disintegration of the publishing sector and the impact on content businesses and technology moving forward. And Robert had some interesting thoughts about this journey they've gone on from the transition from an advertising model to a subscription model, neither of which work. And he had a few points I thought just worth raising. The first was that he could survey the landscape in front of him and see, given a result of the writers' market becoming one of these ultimate gig economies, remote working and all, and the complete devaluation of the publishing and the content business, he could survey the landscape and see completely undervalued assets out there. Because as this has been the atomization of the publishing business, you could, and there are only a couple of them. His go-to example was the New Yorker. consistently great ability to bring together long-form articles that people would be prepared to pay for on each individual basis if they were able to do so. And he saw this as a transition towards revaluing that content, that information, that important asset. And when pushed as to where this might take him, what he thought that world, the content world, might therefore become, he invoked the Netflix model. And he invoked it in terms of what Apple's doing with Apple News and the success that Netflix has had. And this is where I suddenly began paying attention, because this was interesting now, not least because those of us in that world would think he was wrong, would sit there and say the Netflix position, the Netflix company, looks like it's about to be in some trouble, if it's not already. It looks like that trajectory is about to become rather difficult for them, and that their model is going to go through a transformation and change, if not, maybe even die. But it's certainly going to go through quite a transformation. And the reasons are very obvious and straightforward. The competition is moving in. That identification of the market gap that Netflix had very successfully seen and gone after, the lack of valuation of the core piece, others are now doing it. ABC, CBS, BBC, everyone is beginning now to lock down their asset and value the pieces of content individually within there. And now we're in a new model. Now they're throwing unsustainable amounts of capital at these developments, and that's not going to end in a very pretty fashion with the amount of money that's coming, unless you're Martin Scorsese or Zhang Yimou or some of these people who are getting thrown multi-million dollars on these wonderful deals. But a segue that's not a segue at all. How many of you have used one of those food ordering services in the last week? You know, Uber Eats, Grab Eats, Go Eats. Yeah, and why not? How on earth do those things work? Economically, how do they work? I mean, let's be honest, they don't. We know this. I can sit in my office and order a blackberry smoothie with protein supplements for $6.15 and it will get to me in 20 minutes. I'm not paying for the transportation, I'm not paying for the quality, I'm not paying control, I'm not paying for the insurance. I'm not worried about any of those issues except that they get it to me within 20 minutes and I get to enjoy my blackberry smoothie. And then we get surprised at the unintended consequences of increased accidents, increased congestion, and so on. And so Robert was thinking his way through this, and he was asked where he would like, therefore, potentially to see this writer's market going. And he came up with a proposition I think is actually interesting and probably correct. He looked backwards and said, the Starbucks impact upon the London coffee scene. You know, you go back, and this, no Brexit jokes, please, I'm trying to be sensitive. You go back far enough and you pay 20p, 30p for a cup of coffee, you had no control over quality. And, yeah, that was what you got. Starbucks comes in, does two things. Commoditizes the process and gentrifies the experience. And so now people are prepared to pay £5 or £6 for a cup of coffee. And here was his punchline to this with the whole experience and the valuation. They'll pay £5 or £6 for the coffee, and quite happily so. Yeah, always good coffee, reliable experience. Maybe you don't like Starbucks, maybe it's not the great coffee, maybe it's not artisanal, but good, reliably good. They'll be prepared to pay £5 or £6 for that experience, and they aren't prepared to pay anything for the writing they consume when they sit down and have that cup of coffee. And he thinks that's changing, and I think he's right. And that's the first proposition I want to make. The long term, and I've put that in question marks because I believe it's happening far faster than we understand, trend is towards the valuation of the asset that we haven't done. Data plus what it enables. And this leads to the second area, that one of economic impact. Now, we're doing a project right now in Myanmar, similar to a few that we're doing around the region, with the Central Bank of Myanmar. I think they call it modernising the bank, using these new technologies to help them extend their reach, have impact, actually put some modernised financial tools out there into the economy, and have some control. And in reality, this is a collation of some quite distinct projects that aren't under any one coherent heading. we're deploying a centralised QR code system because we wanted to get those retail payments tools out into the marketplace that don't really exist in Myanmar in any substantive way. When they worked out that that wasn't going to get them where they wanted, we then overlay or undergirded a real-time payment system. Then we realised we had to build a national payment switch, which we're now doing. And then we were going to renew all of the acquiring licenses so that all of these new-coming businesses, the fintechs and so on, weren't going to be kept out by the big banks, so everybody had that level playing field. And then because this is Myanmar, we were going to do all the processing of data overseas. So I've got to write them a cloud computing regulation so that they can do all of this now and translate it back in. And there's related regulations and a data analytics and analysis package. All this happening at the same time because they've seen that there's a lot of transactions now happening up in the north of the country involving trade and development that they literally cannot see. It's sitting in China while it's taking place in Myanmar, but that's for another time. The objective in this project, again, not unique, interoperability, oversight, financial inclusion. Now, traditionally, 1 and 3 involved a trade-off. You picked one or the other, and then you brought in the other over time, with 2, that oversight function, being the given, particularly from a central bank perspective. You wanted to believe you had oversight. Now, however, there is a belief. It looks like it may not be the case that 1 and 3 require any trade-off at all. In fact, you may need to do both of these at the same time to achieve either. And here's the kicker to this equation. Number 2 appears to become the trade-off. The central bank has less oversight, questionable oversight, needs to work with others on its oversight to manage the economy. Now, this equation that we're seeing is happening across a range of sectors. This idea of getting the price way down for participation so you bring in the volume play, this long tail accompaniment, and this creates the virtuous cycle. And we're seeing this across a range of domains now. Not just payments and transactions, I've got it for the network industries here and invoked lovely Netflix, but also data privacy, data governance and oversight, data management, if you will, along with all the sectors and silo developments we've been hearing about. But for this model to work, this idea, look at it from the Central Bank of Myanmar's perspective in this approach. They can't do this on their own. In fact, from a CBM perspective, they can't do any single one of those aspects on their own. Private capital and operation is built in intrinsically to the way they have to approach this. It has to be private capital and the state working together to put any opportunity in place. But how do you do these private plus public construction arrangements? How do we even make this begin to happen? And here's the second proposition. Again, this appears to be moving very quickly. There will be new public-private models emerging for joint development and construction based upon data access, sharing, and usage. And look at the fine print there for the kind of sectors and developments we're talking about. And this leads me to the third bit, that impact thing, economic impact. And this one is really challenging, particularly if you're looking at it from, say, a Central Bank of Myanmar, just to use the example. Is anyone from the Central Bank of Myanmar here? Am I about to lose my gig? Is anyone? No? Okay. Central Bank of Myanmar needs to make bets. Limited funds, limited resources, limited political capital, limited capacity. You are making bets, and this is true of all of our economies. These are big initiatives that we're trying to roll out, infrastructural and otherwise, to enable all of these developments. And if you're going to make these bets, you need to be able to see some wins. You need to be able to measure this. But where do we see impact? How do we see impact? How do we measure this impact? And in the digital world, this is a real problem because we have none of the statistics. We do not have consistent, comparable, digital measurement facility right now. And if we cannot measure the impact, what is it? How do we tell it's happened, and how do we place these bets, double down on them, and start invoking these changes that you're hearing about? The focus on the labour communities. Think about what has just been invoked by Michael in terms of the great initiative Singapore's undertaking. If you're in Myanmar, and work out these are the trainings you've got to go through. Think about the challenges that both Kenya and the Philippines have had in following these trajectories, with what they have to bet on to make this leapfrogging initiative happen and work. And here's where we get into real challenges, because this is true across most of our key technology revolution drivers that we're talking about. This inability to measure development, success, and impact. Ubiquitous connectivity, AI, IoT, smart cities. Think smart cities. Think about the amazing amounts of investment and capacity we have to pour in to make the smart cities work. Surveillance, awareness, comfortability, let alone the integrated technology that has to work across multiple different domains if this is to be made feasible and acceptable to people. Which leads me to the third proposition. There will rapidly begin to emerge a set of baseline digital economy and digital trade measurements which, this is the important part, based upon data, use of data, the production and consumption of data, and trade in data. And this is the only way this world is going to progress without that digital divide happening at an unbelievably rapid rate. But in the interest of time, what's the way forward? I didn't want to come and harangue on the same issue again, lack of measurements, problems of digital divide, and leave you in a negative space. So how do we take this forward? Well, I think we now begin to see the developments and what we need to do about this. We need to refocus on our framing of these technology development impact issues from both the top down and the bottom up, but do it in a way we haven't done before, simultaneously. We have to frame the governance at the same time we are now using evidence-based proof points to be able to do those double down bets, which means the policy initiatives have to be holistic and the regulators have to get out of the way. We have to retrain our regulators to be flexible, responsive, agile, to be able to take these evidence-based reforms upon and regulate as second, third, or fourth steps down the path. We need to employ process-based approaches because those risk-based approaches do not work in the current siloed approach we have for trying to drive these progressions out. And we need data-based measurements to be able to assess the impact. And here's what that last point begins to look like, why we believe. Finally, we begin to believe we're making headway on this issue for how we frame up what those measurements begin to look like in a globally comparable fashion. And for ASEAN, and we think we're beginning to develop this for APEC, we have an early model of what we're beginning to develop around those measurements and indicators: digital trade and logistics, data protection and cybersecurity, digital payments and identities, digital skills and talent, innovation and entrepreneurship, institutional infrastructure, readiness. And here is how we're beginning to look at each of those pillars based on indicators that we either have, can begin to generate, working with, in some instances, proprietary private sector data that gets anonymized and worked on a common access basis, open data models and open data sharing models, to give you two pillars that begin to develop and what are the indicators that we will need to be able to make economic models for digital economy and trade developments going forward that are comparable, sustainable, and allow us to track impact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Some people say to me, economy now very much data-driven, and the key challenges also related to data. Data ownership, privacy, data accounting, data management, on the thing, right? Whatever you talk about the business model, talk about regulation, on about the data, right? Last but not least, can I invite Only? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Bu Mari, Pangestu, and CSIS and PECC for having me here. So, you guys must be sleepy now. So I have good news. I only have 10 minutes. So it's a quick one, okay? So previous speakers talk a lot about outside Indonesia and global issue. I want to focus about Indonesia. I returned to Indonesia about 8 years ago. So I want to share with you what I observed and what I learned for the past 8 years, specifically Indonesia for digital. So one thing that a lot of people knows about Indonesia is the gap between the rich and poor is wide, right? And actually, when I observe this, I put that in an analogy like in digital. Actually, it's very, very similar, right? In fact, one of my teams just returned visiting like the second and third tier city. A lot of these technology terms that we use today, they are not even familiar. So let's see what digital divide means here. If I use Wikipedia as the source, just like anything else, it evolves, the definition. Having and not having access. That's as simple as that. Actually, Indonesia is improving. So it evolves to become whether the bandwidth is more stable or faster, right? And then once you have that, the other one is whether they have skill or not. Now, because I spend most of my time in the first tier city like Jakarta, Surabaya, Bandung, all of these things, actually one thing that I observe, even they have all the skill, they have all these, the resources, the bandwidth, and yet they have the wrong mindset about the digital. So if we look for the past 60 years, I like to use after the World War II as a modern of computing, right? Because computer idea has been around for centuries, but the one that commercially available is starting with mainframe, right after the World War II, basically. Right? If you look every 7-10 years, there are always major breakthrough, right? From mainframe up until today. Some of you, I think, old enough to know about all this evolution. So, again, back to the mindset divide. I'm going to use this divide a lot. So it started with PC, right? And then internet divide, and then cloud computing divide, mobile computing divide, and then AI divide now. What I mean by this is this. Every major breakthrough in this technology, they're actually evolution all of this. Like PC, for example. It started as a desktop. It evolves to a server, laptop, tablet as we know it today. Same thing with internet, right? Internet started just static HTML5 for sharing info, but now it has e-commerce, social networking, media, anything you can think of. Internet has it. It evolved from Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and so on. Cloud computing also the same. It evolved from infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and so on, right? Mobile computing divide is even more. We first started with voice a century ago, and then we have Nokia feature phone, we have BlackBerry, now we're in the era of iPhone and Android, right? AI is the same. We started from AI, machine learning, deep learning, reinforcement learning, who knows what comes next, right? A lot of people know on the surface level, and they use a lot of this terminology, the terms of the month of the year, like AI today is. However, they actually don't have enough depth understanding what this thing means. Now, let's find out why. This is some of, obviously it's not complete, right? If you look, right now, a lot of the Gen Z start working now. They start graduating, and of course the Gen Y, the millennial, and Gen X, and baby boomers, like myself. If you look, this Gen Z and Gen Y, they were born connected already. They take this internet connection and mobile, internet, cloud for granted. In fact, they feel strange if they don't have this, right? Gen X, depending how old are you, whether you're beginning or the end of Gen X, is a mix. There are people very, very like digital native, they feel right at home. On the other hand, if you look, baby boomers, I'm a kind of exception because this is my job. So I keep up with this thing. But many of people, they start asking their children, their nephew, their nieces, hey, how do you do this thing, right? I'm sure some of you, the Gen Y and Gen Z, got a phone call many times, or even yourself asking your children about this, or grandchildren for that matter. So this is kind of digital native and digital immigrant. So this is one of those things, if you don't understand it, you don't appreciate it, you don't use it, you're not going to invest in it. Okay? So that's the native versus immigrants. Now let's say, find out the reason why. So I have a few theory about this. Ignorance, you cannot blame them because if they don't know, there's nothing much you can do about it. But once you educate them, whether their mindset can open-minded enough, growth mindset versus, well, I've been successful with what I've been doing, why should I change, right? This is one of those things they say, well, what gets you here will not get you there, right? And then the other one is, no, I'm going to wait. Wait and see attitude, right? That's another one. Of course, the other one, well, you have money, but you don't have the skill. Because it is true, finding technologies skills is extremely hard. This is actually a global issue. There are shortage in these skills, right? Lack of infrastructure. In year 2000, I visited China. You know, visited all these thousands of temples, palaces, but I forgot all of those. I only remember one thing. This is year 2000, almost 20 years ago. I went to remote places, mountain, forest. I landed in Beijing and big city, and then I have to drive 6 hours to get all these remote villages. Guess what? This was in 2000. All those remote places have internet access. If they did have that in 2000, what that means is they invested years before. And you can see the result today, those investment, right? Those are infrastructure. And it's hard. It is true it's hard, but it's no excuse not to do it. Expensive, relatively speaking. Expensive relative to what? Is this because you want to save money to the point your company go bankrupt? Or you want to spend money, make sure you get the return of investment to grow your company. Okay. So these are some of those things. I'm sure there are more, right? Some of them, well, I just have to do it now. They don't have patience, they don't have this thing. If small project fail, see, it doesn't work, let's abandon this. So these are some of the reasons that I observe actually happening here. Now let's see some solution about this. There's some potential because there's no single silver bullet about this. So first, if you look back in the US, 17th, 18th century when there was some slavery, what is the differentiation between the master and the slave? One can read and write and the other one cannot read, cannot write, right? That's one, right? And then in computer age, if we redefine this, not only reading and writing, actually you add computational thinking. This is the way how, when you have problem and knowing how computer works, how it could help you, then you can use computer to solve this. In fact, I have two children. When they were like elementary 6, I started teaching them how to program. This is when they were 11, 12 years old. Now both of them are majoring in computer science. So I know the tools today in computer, they become so sophisticated and easy enough, even kids can understand this. About 3 years ago, Bu Inge started this program, BEBRAS, joined 60 countries worldwide, right? Start teaching computational thinking, elementary, junior, and high school. In fact, last month, many of you might not know this, some of our software engineers here, the team Olim Computer Indonesia actually won first place in world competition. President Jokowi invited them to the palace last night. So we do have the resources and the raw talent. What we need is to invest in them. So that's the basic one. Now, when is it safe to invest in technology or anything for that matter, right? Because am I too early? Am I too late? Am I about the right time? So there are many criteria. I use this as a guideline. Government support, right? Second, academia research and teaching. When they pass their research, they start mass production, they start training their students, you actually have skilled workers. And then the industry adoption. What is a great example about this? Internet, as we know it today. That started as a government project with academia. And then in the early 90s, we commercialized this. And look where we are today with internet. So let's take a look at some specific example for AI. This is G20 plus. Every country on this list has declared their AI as a strategic initiative, not only for social economy, but also for military, for offense and defense. This is actually including Indonesia, right? And these are some of those researchers that actually changed our life today. Like 3 of them here, 3 professors actually invented deep learning, okay? And they won this Turing Award. Turing Award, like in the computer industry, like the Oscar. The criteria for you to win Turing Award is if you make a major breakthrough that long-lasting in the computer industry. So deep learning is one of them. They were awarded last year. So these are just 10 of them that the practitioners, the researchers that change our life for decades to come, even century for that matter, right? And then here is another one, industry adoption. This is billions of people are using AI power application. They're just not aware about it. If you're using Google Search, if you're using YouTube, you're using Facebook, if you're using Gmail, you are using AI. Okay, so I only have 3 minutes left. Let's see, make this quick. Education, just like everything else. Educate. If they are ignorant, you cannot blame them, but after you educate. And then commitment. Partner with industry experts, because there are a lot of experts, fortunately, in this field. Partner with universities. Nurturing raw talents. And of course, just like any software, you need internationalization and localization. You build infrastructure and invest. In fact, I just finished my budgeting last week. My boss told me, you should have set aside budget for failure. We don't want to have failure and learn from it. So AI is one of them that we did a few years ago. So with this guy is a former Nokia. Obviously, they did everything right because Nokia wants the leader in phone, feature phone. They didn't do anything wrong, but somehow they lost. The reason they lost, because the customer is asking a smartphone. They don't want feature phone anymore. So they did everything right for the wrong reason. The time is over, game over. Same thing with this guy. The answer is yes. You can do it today. You can save money. Don't use PC, internet, and smartphone. You could save money. But you will be irrelevant soon because your customer demand it, your competitors doing it. So with this, I think in the history, human mankind, we collected more data than ever. We have the tools, we have the way to collect this. As a result, we can build all these things. From raw data, we process it, become useful information, become knowledge, and then we have some wisdom to learn from all these things, right? So we know what, we know why, we know how. So those are the paths. As a result, we also can, hopefully we can predict the future with all of this, right? The more data you have, the more you process it, the less riskier your decision. So enough about this theory. So what have we done at GDP? So we are hoping that GDP could make a small contribution in Indonesia by investing in talent, not only organically in Indonesia, but also globally. So hopefully we can accelerate the AI adoption in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Only. On your problem, also our problems. But the difference is Indonesia already have AI strategy, right? But Vietnam, we don't have that. We have a digital transformation strategy, and AI as one of the core of that strategy, but not a specific AI strategy. That's our only differences, okay? Because of time constraint, okay. You would like to say something? Oh, okay. No, okay. Sorry. I would like to ask you some question but because of time constraint, so floor now is open. You can post your question into the Slido, or you can use traditional way, ask through microphone directly to the speaker. Please. No? Okay. I ask you a question first, right? Everything changed, comparative advantage, particularly in services, right? And you said now you need to focus on service-led development. You are also expert of WTO, right? So how the WTO can change the services liberalization format to comply with what we see in future globalization in terms of services, mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, mode 4, that's enough? Oh, no change.
Thank you very much for that. So I think my answer is going to be a little disappointing because I think we have much of the governance we need. So in 1994, the whole world set up the General Agreement on Trade and Services. And Mode 1, maybe not everybody in the audience is a trade guru. So Mode 1 is traditional exports, where the service provider is in one country and the service buyer is in another. Mode 2 is tourism, like with the consumers go to the service. And Mode 3 is the other way around with local provision. And Mode 4 is migration. So I'm only talking about the first one. And as it turns out, in 1994, the rich countries did not anticipate ever importing services from developing countries. Remember, this was before floppy disks were very big. This was before cell phones. And as a consequence, most of the rich countries made commitments in all the sectors to not put up barriers for Mode 1 services. Because in 94, it was all the other way around. So we don't really need new governance to do this. The second thing is we have a digital moratorium on tariffs on transmissions already, so it's free trade. Now, if you think about it, this is how India could do such an amazing export of services without signing a single free trade agreement. All that business processing outsourcing, Infosys, all that grew up without a single bit of state-to-state agreement. It was all private. So unlike trade in goods, it's actually rather difficult to control services crossing borders. And it's almost impossible to come up with rules of origin for services crossing borders. So in my view, this is not what we need right away in terms of access. But there's two things where I think we do need more governance. The first is taxation. So the people work on Upwork, most of them probably don't pay taxes anywhere. I talked with the Upwork CEO, Stephen Kessel, at Davos this year in January, and I asked him, well, what do you do about that? And he says, well, in the United States, we give a 1099, which is a miscellaneous tax form, to all American-based freelancers. So the IRS, the American tax authorities, might know about it. And I said, well, what do you do about Sri Lanka? And he goes, well, they don't ask. If Sri Lanka asked, if Indonesia asked, they would give you the data on the money they're transferring into bank accounts in Indonesia. So all we would really need is cooperation to get the taxation right. The second is labor standards. So, and I'm not talking about fancy labor standards or anything like that, just ILO basic labor standards, which are considered absolutely bog standard in goods. And they're enforced because you can ultimately go to the factory where the t-shirts or soccer balls are made. But you can't do that in services. And I'll bet you anything that we will have a Nike-size scandal in photo tagging very soon, where you see underage women chained to chairs in unsanitary conditions, tagging photos for like 30 cents an hour. And somebody will eventually figure out that we have to find a way to enforce minimum standards on the service providers, but we don't yet. So I didn't exactly answer your question, but I hope I talked long enough so nobody remembers what you asked.
Okay. Thank you very much. Peter, you also have mentioned a lot about regulation, data flows, many other things. You would like to add something or say something about that one?
No.
Regulation on services?
No, I really don't. I want to live in Richard's world. It sounds terrific to me. The idea that in 1994 we got this right and that India is going to have an unfettered go of the future. I'm going to buy the book. I like this perspective of the world. I want to live there when I grow up. It's nice.
Okay, one my question to you. Many countries, including Vietnam, try to have a sandbox for fintech, edutech, many other platforms, business. From your perspective, what the key principle for the making sandbox to be appropriate?
To be
Appropriate for everything, regulation, sandbox kind of that. A good sandbox, basically.
who the sandbox?
Any.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me take one step back and so they come across as a little less flippant, because I think Richard's framework is a good one. And the historical trajectories, I think I fundamentally agree with. And there's a point there that I don't think people appreciate anywhere near enough of looking backwards to get our indicators for globalization. I think you're right. I think it's a horribly flawed perspective to be taking. So I like what's getting pointed to. I will just state, so people don't get miscued by my response, that right now, at least in my world of data flows and so on, and data flows basically touch everyone. There's two issues. Compliance costs going through the roof. And our ability to transfer in data is severely getting constrained day by day, step by step. India is a terrific picture right now, and we can step through it, of the constraints on these issues, and so how they weigh into the trade frameworks that they are desperately trying to get themselves inside, RCEP, a reviewed CPTPP, and so on, are really important because of the data localization measures, which mean how you fundamentally drive forth a BPO sector going forward becomes highly questionable. And right now, most of those BPO companies are technically illegal under Europe's GDPR. And sooner or later, that light gets shone upon them, as would be the case for most of Asia. But we can come back to this. To your question of sandboxes, I will promote Sandbox as an example of the kind of frameworks that we need to take forward, because it allows for responsive, agile framing of the rules by which people can participate in economic development. It does, I guess, three things. It allows for innovation companies who otherwise would not be allowed, think of the finance space, to be able to participate in, for a period of time, as long as we can ensure no systemic threat, without needing to go through an onerous licensing period or process, which may be being used as a barrier to participation, number one. Number two, and perhaps even more importantly, it allows regulators to be able to take a stand back rather than having to regulate first with all of these confronting issues, AI developments, surveillance issues, the kind of consumer protection and customer protection and human rights things that Rich is pointing to with workers geotagging and doing all of these issues, trying to look at how we might frame the possibility for Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, instead of just illegally putting a data localization requirement in place and blocking some of this stuff. And so they get to see, third, how the technology is developing. Everyone keeps harping on about just how rapidly technology develops. For the regulators, the policymakers, to sit side by side with a lot of this innovation and learn so that they can get a sense through data sets, through practice, through experience, how to frame what comes next.
Thank you. Question to only that's one, right? How to ensure that Industry 4.0 or digital transformation, whatever, can be inclusive in the sense, MSME or the poor vulnerable group, they can benefit from that one, right? Basically, that two questions.
Yeah, I think in order to make this inclusion and solving this digital divide, education is number one. I think the Indonesian government start doing that. They start giving AI training last summer at various major universities. And then some people like Bu Inge start doing this. Bebra start thinking, educating from elementary school, from the basic stuff until high school. And the university, obviously, I know a lot of major universities now start teaching AI classes now. They asked me to review some of them, which classes they should add, which classes they should drop, because they have a fixed time, right? Only 4 years for their bachelor degree usually. So we give feedback, and then we partner with them, with the industry. We partner because it's mutually beneficial for both the industry as well as the university. And we also participate some government program as well. So I think in order for us to make this technology adoption at scale, it has to be a concerted effort between government, academia, and the industry.
Oh, you, I'm sorry.
I'd just like to add to this point about inclusion. I think that's critical. And I think only you had talked about different divides. And clearly, as we move forward with technology, in terms of industrial transformation, there will be people who will be left behind. And I think we have to be even more conscious about how do we extend opportunities for access and make it affordable and accessible for the broad population segments to be brought along. So one is, I think we need to have broad-based national programs to ensure that we address basic digital literacy. And the bar for digital literacy has gone up. It's no longer sufficient to know how to use Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, turn on a computer. Soon, in the next 5 years, 10 years, knowing how to interpret data, how to apply data to draw insights, that will be the new standard. How do we discern between fake news and real news? That will be the new standard. How do you protect your data through cybersecurity? So we need to have broad-based programs to elevate digital literacy across the board. The second is to make sure that there is increased access to education and training opportunities. And we have to design that specifically for different segments of the population. So one segment, for example, would be in the Asian culture, traditionally, women stay at home to take care of young infants. How do we get back to work women? How do we support them? How do we support ex-offenders? How do we support disadvantaged segments? Not just for economic purposes, but for day-to-day living in society as well. So I think these are critical issues that has to be intentionally designed into our policies, our interventions, to make sure that different segments are assisted. Also, low-wage workers, the mature workers who are being displaced in mid-career, finding it hard to get back into the labor market. So these are specific segments that we need to help.
Yeah, just a quick point, because it's very close to my heart and my professional interests. If I agree that education is so fundamentally important, and please know that I do, if it is so fundamentally important, and keeping that terrific picture that Richard started his presentation, I think, with people sitting in the same room, why on earth are we still doing education the same way, particularly as we move through the various points that you flagged and we move towards AI? Why are we still going through education the same way? Why aren't we blowing that whole model up and allowing the next generation to be doing, and I'm leaving Singapore out, Singapore is very good at this. Why aren't we allowing the next generation to be doing stuff wherever they are, whenever they are, and the retraining and so on? But if I get very nervous about talking to an audience like this and hearing the education message and hearing the literacy message and people thinking that's where we invest our efforts. Blow the whole damn thing up. Start again, focus on objectives because the education piece is important, but man, do we have this wrong.
Just one question. Okay, no more. I would like to ask some more questions, but time's up, right? Sorry about that. Please give the big hand to the speaker and thank you all. Thank you. We are very exciting and meaningful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tan, and all the speakers. Please once again join me in thanking all of them for a very insightful discussion. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Philips Vermonte, Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia, to give token of appreciation for all speakers and moderator and have photo session together afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be having a short coffee break for about 15 minutes. Refreshments are available outside of the conference hall at the promenade near the exhibition booth. Please bear in mind that the next session will begin promptly at 3:30 p.m. Thank you. Additional information for VIP participants, please enjoy your refreshments at the Banda B Hall near the conference stage. Please revert to our organizers for further assistance.